There's a car almost nobody talks about anymore, and that silence is the problem. In 1951, Britain was still piecing itself back together. The war had been over for 6 years, but you wouldn't always know it walking through certain parts of London, Birmingham, or Coventry. Bombed streets were still being cleared. Temporary housing was still considered temporary, years after it had become permanent. And food rationing, actual government-enforced food rationing, wouldn't fully end until 1954. People were tired, cautious, and quietly desperate for something that felt like ordinary life again. Into that world, Austin introduced something small, something modest, something that looked, on the surface, almost apologetically simple. The Austin A30. Say that name to most people today and you'll get a blank stare, maybe a polite nod. Perhaps someone will say, "Wasn't that the one before the Mini?" And they'd be closer to the truth than they realize, but still missing the point entirely. Because the Austin A30 isn't just a footnote in a manufacturer's catalog, it's a foundation. It's the car that helped put Britain back on the road at a moment when Britain had almost nothing left to drive. And it's the car whose engineering quietly, without recognition, funded and shaped one of the most celebrated vehicles in this country's entire automotive history. But here's the part nobody tells you. The A30 never received the credit. It was replaced, discontinued, and overshadowed by the very revolution it made possible. The engineers moved on. The company moved on. Britain moved on. Except for the enthusiasts, they never did. And by the time this video is finished, you're going to understand exactly why that loyalty was earned and what the mainstream got completely wrong about this car. Now, before we get into the engineering, I want you to think about the man who made this car happen. His name was Leonard Lord. He ran Austin through the late 1940s and into the 50s, and if you know anything about the British motor industry of that era, you already know that Leonard Lord was not a gentle person. He was hard, competitive, and deeply personal in his ambitions. He had worked at Morris before Austin, left under difficult circumstances, and channeled whatever came from that experience into a single, consuming objective: beat Morris at everything. To do that, he knew Austin needed a small car, a genuinely small, genuinely affordable car that could compete directly with what Morris was building. That pressure, almost a personal vendetta played out through engineering, is what pushed the A30 into existence. And understanding that is essential to understanding what Austin actually built and why it mattered as much as it did. By 1951, Britain's motor industry was attempting something close to impossible: build cars, sell cars, stay alive. Wartime factories that had spent years producing aircraft components, military vehicles, and munitions had to convert back to civilian production, but the materials were scarce. The labor force was still recovering, and the government had a clear message for manufacturers: export first, supply the home market second. The British buyer who wanted a new car was, in practical terms, last in the queue. Waiting lists for new vehicles in the late 1940s stretched 2, 3, sometimes 4 years. When a car finally arrived, government restrictions prevented immediate resale. The authorities were determined to prevent a black market from developing around freshly manufactured vehicles. You bought your car. You kept your car. That was the arrangement. Into this constrained, pressurized environment, Leonard Lord looked across at Morris, specifically at the Morris Minor. Launched in 1948 and designed by the brilliant and unconventional Alec Isagonis, and felt something sharpen in him. The Minor was a genuine success. Light, nimble, well-designed, and increasingly beloved by the British public, Austin had nothing to match it, not yet. Lord's directive to his engineering team was not complicated: make it small, make it light, make it affordable, make it work. No room for elegance as an end in itself. Results were the only currency. Now here is the first detail that most histories gloss straight over. The Austin A30 was the first Austin ever built using monocoque construction, what engineers call a unitary body. Rather than the traditional method of building a separate chassis and mounting the body on top, The A30 integrated the two into a single structural unit. The shell itself carried the load, no frame underneath. One piece. For Austin in 1951, this was genuinely new territory. It made the car lighter. It made it structurally stiffer. And it established a method of construction that Austin would carry forward into every significant model that followed. Given the budget constraints and the urgent timeline Lord had imposed, committing to this approach took real confidence. But the more consequential decision was under the bonnet. The A30's engine displaced 803 cubic centimeters and produced 28 brake horsepower. Modest figures. Nothing that would make headlines. But this was the first iteration of what the industry would come to know as the A-Series engine, and the A-Series did not retire when the A30 did. It evolved. It was refined through successive models and successive years, and in 1959, 8 years after it first appeared, in this quiet, overlooked saloon, a direct descendant of that engine was installed in a revolutionary new car designed by the very same Alec Issigonis, whose Morris Minor had so frustrated Leonard Lord. That car was the Mini. The A30 is the forgotten grandfather of the Mini. Approximately 223,000 A30s were built across 5 years of production. That commercial output helped fund and sustain the engineering program that brought the A-Series to the point where it could power a vehicle that would define British motoring for a generation. The Mini receives the documentaries, the anniversary editions, the design awards. The A30 provided the foundation and collected nothing in return. You cannot tell the full story of the Austin A30 without talking about the Morris Minor. Because the Minor was the competitor, the A30 was built to beat, and the Minor, consistently and convincingly, won that argument in the marketplace. Alec Issigonis had created something with genuine personality. The Minor's wider wheel tracks gave it more confident handling. Its character was more adventurous. It felt different to drive, and it looked different to park. People buy emotionally as much as they buy rationally, and the Minor had found its way into people's feelings in a way the A30 simply hadn't managed. For Leonard Lord, who had built the A30 specifically to compete with and defeat Morris, this was a wound that stayed open. But here is the nuance that almost every account misses. The A30 and the Minor weren't truly chasing the same buyer. The A30 was, in structural terms, the more modern car monocoque body against the Minor's more conventional approach. Yet technical modernity doesn't automatically translate into public desire. The A30 found its buyers among people who needed dependable transport above all else. Families in terraced houses across the Midlands. Traveling salesmen watching their running costs week by week. Young couples making their very first significant purchase together. These weren't glamorous buyers, but they were consistent buyers, and they bought A30s in genuine numbers. Consider what daily life looked like for those people in the early 1950s. Petrol rationing had lifted in 1950. Just a year before, the A30 went on sale. For a significant portion of the British population, the ability to simply drive somewhere to choose a destination and go there without needing permission or a ration book was still a relatively recent and genuinely appreciated freedom. The A30, priced at around £507 at launch, put that freedom within reach of people for whom it might otherwise have remained out of reach entirely. By 1954, Austin added a 2-door variant to the A30 range alongside the original 4-door. Lighter by design, slightly more dynamic in profile, the 2-door began attracting a different category of interest buyers who saw driving as something to be enjoyed rather than merely endured. That subtle shift revealed something about the car's character that the basic specification sheets had never really communicated. The A30 had more in it than Austin had advertised, and more, it turned out, than most buyers had gone looking for. Before we get to what came next, and the timing of what came next remains genuinely painful to examine, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. If this kind of detailed, honest look at automotive history is what you've been after, the real stories, the uncomfortable details, the context that usually gets edited out, then this channel is exactly where you want to be. Subscribe right now. It costs you nothing and means you'll be here for what comes next. Drop a comment below and tell me if you ever saw an A30 in real life parked on a street you knew or driven by someone in your family. And if this video has been worth your time today, share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Now, back to 1956. 1956. Austin discontinued the A30 and replaced it with the A35. On paper, a straightforward upgrade. The A35 received a larger engine, 848 cubic centimeters, delivering more power, accompanied by a wider rear window, revised instrumentation, and a modernized interior. Sensible improvements, logical, commercial progression. But the A30 itself received nothing. No acknowledgement of 5 years of steady, unglamorous service to British families on British roads during some of the most difficult years the country had navigated since the war. No recognition of the 250,000 households it had helped mobilize. It was simply discontinued, moved past. The way you clear out an old drawer without ceremony when you've decided you're done with it. And then the timing delivered something that history rarely produces quite so precisely, a genuinely cruel irony. In October of 1956, the Suez Crisis erupted. Britain and France intervened militarily in Egypt, following the Egyptian government's nationalization of the Suez Canal. The political consequences were severe. American pressure forced a humiliating withdrawal. And the economic consequences hit British drivers almost immediately. Fuel supplies were threatened, and petrol rationing was briefly reintroduced. For the second time in a decade, Britain was being asked to think carefully about how much it drove and how far. Small, economical, reliable cars suddenly mattered more than they had at any point since the war, precisely the kind of car the A30 had been designed and built to be. The A30 had been taken off sale months before the crisis that would have made it indispensable. It missed its own vindication by a matter of weeks. The Suez Crisis also accelerated something larger. It convinced the leadership of the British Motor Corporation, which Austin had become part of following the merger with Morris in 1952, to fast-track the development of something even smaller and more economical. Alec Isigonis was given the directive and the resources to design what would eventually become the Mini. The engine he used was the A-Series, refined, developed, and proven through its years of service, beginning with the A30. The car that had just been quietly discontinued had funded the engine that powered the car that would define the next decade of British motoring. And the crisis that should, in another timeline, have extended the A30's production life, instead accelerated the project that permanently replaced it. History is not sentimental. It does not pause to acknowledge the vehicles it discards on the way to the next chapter. But the story of the A30 did not end with its discontinuation. What happened over the following decade quietly, away from any showroom or manufacturer's announcement, is where the car finally revealed what it had always been capable of. In the hands of people who were paying proper attention. 630 kilograms. That is the approximate curb weight of the Austin A30. Sit with that figure for a moment. In an era when the average family car tips the scales at well over 1,500 kilograms, 630 sounds almost implausible. But in the context of what club motorsport enthusiasts were looking for in the 1960s, it sounded like an invitation. Because light changes everything. British club motorsport has a long and serious tradition of taking unpretentious cars and finding out what they're genuinely made of when you remove the limitations of polite use. Hill climbs, trials, autocross, club circuit racing. These are disciplines that reward lightness and mechanical honesty over outright power and expense. A heavy car with more power will always lose to a light car with a driver who knows what they're doing, on a course that demands precision rather than brute force. The A30 was a natural fit for exactly this kind of competition. The A-Series engine had been designed, from its origins, to be accessible. Any competent mechanic could understand it and work on it, but it also responded well to careful modification. A revised cylinder head, a more suitable carburetor, attention to valve timing and breathing, and the power output climbed in ways that, combined with that remarkable low weight, translated into genuine pace. There are records and photographs from British motorsport events through the 1960s and into the early 1970s that show A30 seconds competing alongside significantly more modern machinery, not dominating, not collecting championships, but holding their own, finishing races, making more powerful, heavier cars, work considerably harder than their drivers had anticipated. That is its own kind of achievement, and the people doing it understood exactly what they had. What the enthusiast community built around the A30 over those decades was something that the manufacturer never planned for, and the market never valued a living body of specific, practical knowledge. How to find parts, which had remained available, because the A-Series engine continued running in Austin, Morris, and later British Leyland vehicles well into the 1980s. How to manage and prevent rust in the monocoque structure, which was the car's most significant long-term vulnerability. How to maintain the simplicity of the drivetrain while extracting more from it. This knowledge passed between owners, through clubs, through conversations at events, through the kind of direct, person-to-person transmission that doesn't get indexed or archived, but is more reliable than almost anything that does. The Austin A30 Owners Club was formed to keep this alive, and it succeeded because the people involved weren't motivated by investment returns or collector prestige. They were motivated by genuine affection for what the car represented and what it could do. That is a completely different kind of commitment, and it is the reason A30 says are still being driven, maintained, and competed in today, not as museum exhibits, but as working vehicles in the hands of people who made an active choice to keep them that way. The question worth asking now is not how the car survived, it's what it left behind that the mainstream never noticed. There is a pattern in history that repeats with enough consistency that you'd think we would have learned to recognize it by now. The thing that makes the future possible is almost never the thing that gets remembered once the future has arrived. The foundational work, the difficult, unglamorous, commercially essential work, gets buried under the story of whatever came next and was easier to celebrate. The Austin A30 is one of the clearest examples of this pattern in British automotive history. It arrived at precisely the right moment. It did what the country needed. It sold in numbers sufficient to fund and sustain the engineering program that produced the A-Series engine in mature, refined form. It demonstrated that monocoque construction was viable and practical for a mass-market Austin. And then it stepped aside and watched the Mini absorb every piece of credit that the chain of development had produced. The Mini is a genuine icon, that is not in dispute. But the Mini did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived from a lineage, and the first link in that chain was a modest four-door saloon that most people alive today have never heard of. Here is what the footnotes miss entirely. When a family drove an A30 away from a forecourt in 1952, the car was not a footnote to anything. It was the entire story of that family's relationship with mobility. For many, it was the first car they had ever owned, the vehicle that took children to school on wet November mornings, that carried the family's luggage to a rented cottage on the Devon coast in August, that got a husband to work when the bus didn't come and the job couldn't wait, that sat outside a hospital while something important happened inside. These are the histories that don't get written down, but they are the real history of the Austin A30, and they are more accurate than any production figure or road test from a period motoring magazine. If you are watching this, and you remember an A30 from your own life parked in a street you knew or driven by someone in your family, understand that that memory is not sentiment, it is testimony. You saw the car in the context it was built for. That is a record that matters. The enthusiasts who refused to move on were not being stubborn, they were being precise. They recognized that this car's value was not in its auction price or its horsepower figure. It was in what it represented about a specific moment in this country's history and the specific people who lived through it. The Austin A30 represented post-war Britain's determination to get moving again, quietly, without fanfare. with honest engineering and modest expectations and a reliability that the people depending on it could not afford to have fail. That is worth remembering. That is worth preserving. If this is the kind of history you want, more of the real stories, the overlooked detail, the cars and the decisions and the people that the mainstream narrative skips past, then subscribe to this channel right now. It costs you nothing. It means you'll be here for what comes next, and there is plenty coming. Leave a comment below. Tell me if you had any connection to the A30, or if today is the first time you've ever heard of it. Both of those answers matter, and I read every one. If someone in your life would appreciate this story, a father, a grandfather, a friend who spent their youth around cars like this, share it with them today. Not later, today. The Austin A30 moved quietly through one of Britain's hardest decades. It did its job without complaint. It left something behind that is still running. That is more than most things ever manage.